The bag hit the polished airport floor with a muffled thud, and when the contents spilled across the tile, a decorated colonel stopped mid-stride, his weathered face draining of color as recognition struck him like a physical blow. It happened in that chaotic space between gates 14 and 16, where Terminal C swells with humanity during the afternoon rush. The air conditioning hummed overhead, fighting against the Texas heat seeping through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the tarmac. Somewhere in the distance, a gate agent's voice crackled through speakers, announcing a delayed departure to Phoenix. Business travelers hustled past in rumpled suits, dragging roller bags behind them like reluctant dogs. Families clustered near charging stations, kids glued to tablets while parents scrolled through phones. The smell of overpriced coffee mixed with industrial cleaning solution and jet fuel, that distinct airport perfume that exists nowhere else on Earth. She was just another face in the crowd, mid-30s maybe. Brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a faded college sweatshirt that had seen better days. Nothing about her appearance suggested military connection. No service branch t-shirts, no unit insignia, no obvious indicators that would draw a second glance from the casual observer. Her carry-on was standard-issue airport gear, a black rolling bag that could belong to anyone, and a canvas tote slung over her shoulder, stuffed with the usual travel detritus. She was hurrying, not running, but moving with that determined pace of someone who's cutting it close on departure time. Her gate was still 3 down, and the boarding announcement had already started. She wove between slower-moving travelers, offering quick apologies and tight smiles as she navigated the obstacle course of the concourse. That's when it happened. A kid, maybe 8 years old, came tearing around the corner, chasing what looked like a remote-controlled car that buzzed and whirred across the gleaming floor. The boy wasn't watching where he was going, completely absorbed in his toy. The woman tried to sidestep, but her roller bag clipped an elderly couple's luggage. She stumbled, her tote slipping from her shoulder. She grabbed for it, but momentum and physics conspired against her. The canvas bag hit the ground hard. The zipper, probably not fully closed to begin with, gave way, and everything spilled out. The contents scattered across maybe 10 feet of terminal floor. Typical travel stuff at first glance. A paperback novel, its cover bent and creased from being shoved in and pulled out too many times. A charging cable tangled into an impossible knot, a pack of gum, a wallet that had landed open, credit cards visible, a travel-size pack of tissues, a tube of chapstick that rolled toward a trash can, a crumpled boarding pass, and then something else, something that didn't belong. The woman dropped to her knees immediately, her face flushing with embarrassment as other travelers glanced her way. A couple people paused, that instinctive human response to help someone who's dropped their belongings, but she was already scrambling to gather everything before they could step forward. That's when Colonel Robert Hayes saw it. He'd been walking the opposite direction, returning from a conference in Houston, heading home to Virginia. He was in his Class A uniform, the formal Army greens he'd worn for his speaking engagement at Fort Sam Houston. The uniform sat heavy with the weight of 31 years of service, combat infantryman badge, ranger tab, master parachutist wings, ribbons representing 3 wars and countless deployments. The eagles on his shoulders marked him as a full colonel, and the grey, threading through his close-cropped hair, testified to every hard year those decorations represented. He was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from giving the same speech about leadership and sacrifice to yet another group of young officers who couldn't possibly understand, not yet, what those words truly cost. His rolling bag followed behind him, and he'd been mentally calculating whether he had time to grab a sandwich before his gate started boarding. Then his eyes caught on something among the scattered items on the floor. His feet stopped moving, just stopped, like someone had thrown an emergency brake inside his chest. It was small, maybe 3 inches across, circular, lying face up about 4 feet from where the woman knelt, gathering her things with quick, embarrassed movements. From his angle, standing maybe 10 feet away, Colonel Hayes could see it clearly. Too clearly. A medallion. A challenge coin. But not just any challenge coin. This one was matte black with gold accenting. The design was distinctive, a sword crossed with a lightning bolt surrounded by 13 stars. No unit designation visible from this angle, but the colonel didn't need to see the other side. He'd know that design anywhere. He'd carried one himself once, lost it during an insertion in the Hindu Kush in 2008. He'd grieved that loss like losing a limb. Because that particular coin wasn't handed out to just anyone. You didn't buy these at the PX. You didn't get them for showing up. You didn't earn them through regular service, no matter how exemplary. That coin came from one unit, one very specific unit that officially didn't exist. A unit whose operations were so classified that most members of Congress didn't know its full mission parameters. The kind of unit where members didn't talk about their service even decades after retirement, where names never appeared in citation write-ups, where medals for valor were presented in closed ceremonies with no photographers present. The colonel's hands had gone cold. His mouth had gone dry. The terminal noise, all those announcements and conversations and footsteps and rolling wheels, seemed to fade into a distant hum. The woman had gathered most of her things. She shoved the paperback back into her bag, scooped up the wallet, grabbed the chapstick. Her hand was reaching for the challenge coin, fingers outstretched. "Ma'am." The word came out rougher than Colonel Hayes intended. Command voice. The tone that had stopped junior officers mid-sentence and snapped entire companies to attention. The woman's hand froze inches from the coin. She looked up. Her eyes were green, the colonel noticed, wide with surprise at being addressed by a stranger and probably embarrassed about the spectacle she'd created. She blinked, taking in his uniform, the rank on his shoulders, the insignia marking him as someone who'd seen and done things most civilians couldn't imagine. "Yes," she said, cautious, slightly defensive, the universal tone of someone who thinks they're about to be scolded. The colonel stepped closer. His shadow fell across her and the scattered contents of her bag. Other travelers continued to flow around them like water around stones in a stream, barely noticing the scene unfolding. He pointed at the challenge coin with a hand that was absolutely steady, despite the chaos in his chest. "Where did you get that?" It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't a polite inquiry either. It was the question of a man who needs to know something right now, whose entire worldview might depend on the answer. The woman followed his gaze to the coin. Something shifted in her expression, the embarrassment melting away, replaced by something harder to read, sadness maybe, or resignation, or perhaps a flash of anger at being questioned by a stranger, no matter what rank sat on his shoulders. Her hand moved. She picked up the coin, holding it flat on her palm, studying it for a moment as if seeing it for the first time in a while. When she looked back up at the colonel, her eyes had changed. Still green, but now holding something that made his breath catch, a depth of understanding that didn't match her civilian clothes or her hurried travel demeanor. "It was my brother's," she said quietly. 3 words. Just 3 words. But they hit Colonel Hayes like incoming fire, because people didn't have brothers in that unit. People didn't know about that unit. Family members weren't told, weren't briefed, weren't given challenge coins as keepsakes. Those coins stayed with operators until they died or lost them in the field. They didn't end up in sisters' bags being carried through civilian airports in Texas. "Your brothers," the colonel repeated. It wasn't a question. He was processing, calculating, running through possibilities and finding them all impossible. Yes. She was still on her knees, surrounded by the detritus of her spilled bag, but she held the coin like it was the only thing that mattered, the only thing in this entire terminal that was real. A family of 4 walked past, the father glancing down at the scene with mild curiosity before his wife pulled him along. A gate agent's voice announced pre-boarding for a flight to Seattle. The smell of cinnamon rolls from a nearby Cinnabon wafted through the recycled air. Colonel Hayes's mind was racing. That unit had lost operators. God, they'd lost so many. Operations that never made the news. Casualties that were never publicly acknowledged. Men and women who disappeared from the official record as if they'd never served at all. He'd known some of them, worked alongside them on joint operations, watched them board helicopters headed for missions he wasn't cleared to know about. Some of them never came back. And some of the ones who did come back weren't really back, not completely. They'd left pieces of themselves in places whose names were redacted from mission reports, in firefights that officially never happened, in villages that didn't exist on maps given to generals. The woman was standing now, having quickly gathered the rest of her belongings, while the colonel stood frozen in his thoughts. She held the coin between her thumb and forefinger, and for just a moment the afternoon light through the terminal windows caught on the gold detailing, making it flash. "I shouldn't have said that," she said, softer now. "I'm sorry. I need to catch my flight." She started to turn away. "Wait!" Colonel Hayes's hand shot out, not touching her, but extended in a gesture that was part stop sign, part plea. She paused. Their eyes met, and in that moment, standing in the middle of Terminal C at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, surrounded by travelers who had no idea what they were witnessing, the colonel saw something in this woman's face that made his 31 years of service suddenly feel inadequate to the moment. She knew, not suspected, not guessed. She knew what that coin meant, what it represented, what it cost. "What was his name?" the colonel asked. His voice had lost its command edge. Now it was something else entirely, something closer to the tone used in memorial ceremonies, in the moments after they play taps and fold the flag. The woman's jaw tightened. She blinked twice, fast, like she was fighting something back. "I really need to catch my flight, Colonel." "I know that unit," Hayes said, quiet, firm. "I've worked with them. I need to know. What was his name?" The woman looked down at the coin in her hand, then back up at the colonel, then past him toward her gate, where she could probably hear the boarding announcements calling her row number. She was calculating something, running her own risk assessment, deciding whether to trust this stranger in uniform or to simply walk away and let the moment pass into airport anonymity. People made decisions like this every day. Little choices in airports and grocery stores and parking lots, to engage or to keep moving, to share or to protect, to let someone in or to maintain the walls we all build for safety. The woman took a breath. "Captain Michael Chen," she said. "Army. Special Operations. That's all I can tell you." She said the name like it hurt, like it was something sacred and wounded at the same time. Colonel Hayes felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The terminal swam for a moment. The lights seemed too bright. The air seemed too thin, because he knew that name. God help him, he knew that name. What fell out of that bag wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a door to a story that had been sealed shut, classified, buried under layers of operational security and official silence. And now, in the middle of a crowded airport on an ordinary afternoon, that door had been cracked open. The woman could see the recognition in the colonel's face. She wasn't surprised. She looked resigned to it, actually. Like this had maybe happened before, or like she'd always known it would happen eventually. "You knew him," she said. Not a question. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly. His throat had closed up. Professional composure, the kind drilled into you through decades of military bearing, was barely holding. "Gate 17, the woman said, glancing at her boarding pass. "They're probably on final boarding call. I really can't miss this flight." But she didn't move, neither did the colonel. They stood there, two people connected by a name and a piece of metal, while the rest of the world rushed past them, oblivious. And the colonel knew, with absolute certainty, that he couldn't let her walk away. Not yet. Not until he understood how Michael Chen's sister ended up carrying his challenge coin through an airport in Texas, 15 years after the mission that officially never happened. The boarding announcement for Gate 17 echoed through the terminal for the second time. Final call. The woman, she still hadn't told him her name, glanced toward her gate with visible anxiety. Her fingers tightened around the challenge coin. "I have to go," she said again, but her feet remained planted. Colonel Hayes stepped closer, lowering his voice. Around them, the airport continued its relentless rhythm. A maintenance worker pushed a cleaning cart past. A young couple argued about whether they had time for Starbucks. Nobody paid attention to the colonel and the woman, standing in a bubble of tension that only they could feel. "Michael Chen," Hayes said quietly. "Operation Copper Valley, February 2010. Am I right?" The woman's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks so fast the colonel thought she might actually faint. Her free hand shot out to grab the handle of her rolling bag, steadying herself. "You can't know that," she whispered. That's classified. That operation doesn't exist." "I was there," Hayes said. "Not with his team. I was running logistics from Bagram, but I was there when they came back, when some of them came back." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She blinked rapidly, fighting them back with visible effort. Her jaw clenched. She looked away toward the windows, toward the planes on the tarmac, toward anywhere but the colonel's face. "Miss Chen," Hayes said, making an educated guess about her last name. "Please, 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." She let out a shaky breath. "It's not Chen anymore. I got married, divorced, it's—" She stopped herself. "That doesn't matter, and I can't talk about this. You know I can't talk about this." "I know," Hayes said, "but I need to understand. How do you have his coin? Family members don't get those coins. They don't even know those coins exist." A businessman in an expensive suit nearly collided with them, muttering an irritated "excuse me" as he swerved around. The woman watched him pass, then looked back at the colonel with something close to defiance in her eyes. "Maybe you don't know everything about that unit, Colonel." "Maybe I don't," Hayes admitted. "So tell me what I'm missing." She shook her head. "I don't even know you. You could be—" She paused, studying his uniform again, taking in the details, the ribbons, the badges, the name tape that read Hayes in black letters. "You could be anyone. Robert Hayes, Colonel, 4th Infantry Division, currently assigned to Army Futures Command. Before that, I spent 8 years attached to JSOC at Bragg. I've got a TSSCI clearance with full lifestyle poly. I've run support for operations in 13 countries, whose names I can't say in civilian spaces. And I was at Bagram Airfield in February 2010, when your brother's team came back from a valley in Kunar province after 48 hours of hell." He paused, watching her reaction. "I remember him, because he was one of only 3 who walked off that Chinook under their own power. And I remember thinking that all 3 of them looked like they'd seen something that broke them from the inside out." The woman's composure cracked. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily with the back of her hand. "You can't tell me anything I don't already know," she said, but her voice had lost its defensive edge. Now it just sounded tired, sad, worn down by years of carrying something too heavy for one person. "Then tell me how you got the coin," Hayes pressed gently, "because I've been around special operations my entire career, and I've never seen family members with unit challenge coins, especially not from that unit." The final boarding announcement for Gate 17 came through the speakers. This time it was more urgent, more official. The tone that meant, if you're not at the gate right now, you're getting left behind. The woman looked at the coin in her hand, then at her gate, then back at Colonel Hayes. She was making a calculation. He could see it happening behind her eyes. Risk versus necessity, privacy versus the desperate human need to be understood by someone who might actually comprehend what you've been carrying alone. "They're going to close that door," she said. "There are other flights," Hayes replied, "not for another 5 hours. Then we'll have 5 hours to talk." She studied him, really looked at him this way, not at his rank or his uniform, but at his face, at whatever she could read there that might tell her whether this man could be trusted with what she'd been holding close for 15 years. Whatever she saw must have satisfied something, because she let out a long breath and her shoulders dropped slightly. "There's a coffee shop," she said, nodding toward a generic chain cafe near Gate 14. "But I need to call and explain why I'm missing this flight, and it's not going to be a short conversation." "Take your time," Hayes said. They walked together toward the cafe, the woman pulling her rolling bag behind her, while Hayes matched her pace. She kept the challenge coin clutched in her hand, visible but protected, like she couldn't quite bring herself to put it back in her bag where it might spill out again. The cafe was half empty, the lull between morning rush and afternoon surge. They found a table near the window with a view of the tarmac. The woman excused herself to make her phone call, stepping away toward the restrooms where it would be quieter. Hayes ordered 2 black coffees and claimed the table, sitting where he could watch her at the end of the hallway. She was on the phone for nearly 10 minutes. He watched her posture shift, defensive at first, then explanatory, then apologetic. She gestured with her free hand the way people do when they're trying to make a point to someone who can't see them. Finally, she nodded to herself, said something that looked like okay and thank you, and ended the call. When she returned to the table, she looked both relieved and anxious. "My supervisor understood," she said, sliding into the chair across from Hayes. "Sort of. I teach high school history in Cleveland. They're not thrilled about me missing tomorrow, but it's not like I do this regularly." She picked up the coffee Hayes had ordered for her, wrapping both hands around the paper cup like she needed the warmth, despite the climate-controlled terminal. "High school history," Hayes repeated. "What do you teach them about recent military operations?" A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Not much. Most of it's still classified. I stick to World War II and Vietnam. Things that have been declassified long enough that I won't end up in Leavenworth for unauthorized disclosure." "Your brother teach you to be careful about that?" "My brother taught me a lot of things," she said quietly. She set down her coffee and placed the challenge coin on the table between them. It sat there like a grenade, with the pin pulled, small, innocuous looking, but capable of destroying everything nearby. Hayes looked at it. Even in the artificial lighting of the airport cafe, the craftsmanship was evident, the detail work, the weight of meaning pressed into metal. "His name was Michael," she began, not looking at Hayes, but at the coin. "Mike. Everyone called him Mike except our mother, who insisted on Michael until the day she died. He was 4 years older than me. Joined the army right out of high school, because college didn't suit him and our family didn't have money anyway. He was smart, though, scary smart, the kind of smart that gets noticed." Hayes sipped his coffee and listened. He'd learned a long time ago that the best thing you could do for someone carrying a story like this was simply to shut up and let them tell it. "He went through basic at Fort Benning," she continued. "Did well enough that they pushed him toward Ranger School. He passed that. Then he volunteered for selection. That's when he kind of disappeared from our lives. Phone calls got rare. Visits home stopped completely. Mom was upset. Dad understood better. He'd been Marines in the Gulf War. He knew there were some jobs where you couldn't come home and tell your family what you did." She picked up the coin, turning it over in her fingers. The reverse side showed a skull wearing a tactical helmet, flanked by radio call numbers that meant nothing to civilians and everything to the people who'd carried them. "I was in college when Mike got assigned to the unit this coin represents," she said. "He couldn't tell me what unit, couldn't tell me where he was stationed, couldn't tell me anything except that he was okay, and he'd call when he could. The calls came maybe once every 3 or 4 months, sometimes from numbers I didn't recognize, sometimes from blocked numbers. He always sounded tired, but he also sounded—" She paused, searching for the word, "purposeful, like he'd found the thing he was meant to do, even if it was killing him." A group of teenagers walked past the cafe, laughing about something on someone's phone. The sound felt intrusive, wrong for the conversation happening at this table. "February 2010, Hayes said gently, bringing her back to the timeline. She nodded. "February 2010. I was 24, teaching my first year at a middle school in Akron. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was Mike. He sounded wrong. His voice was wrong. Flat. Like someone had reached inside him and turned off everything that made him who he was. Her hands were shaking slightly. She set the coin down on the table again and wrapped her hands back around her coffee cup. He told me he was stateside. He said he had a week of leave. He wanted to see me, not our parents. They'd both passed by then. Mom from cancer and Dad from a heart attack a year later. Just me. He said it was important. She looked up at Hayes. When someone you love says it like that, when you can hear in their voice that something fundamental has changed, you don't ask questions. You just say yes. Where did you meet? Hayes asked. A park in Pittsburgh, halfway between where I was living and where he said he was catching a flight from. He picked the spot, secluded, no crowds. Just a picnic table by a creek. Her voice had gone distant, like she was back there, sitting at that table. He looked terrible, Colonel. He'd lost weight. His eyes had this look, like he was seeing through me to something behind me, something that scared him. She was quiet for a moment, lost in the memory. We talked for 3 hours, she finally continued. He didn't tell me about the operation, didn't give me details, but he told me that he'd done something necessary but unforgivable. He said his team had gone into a village in Afghanistan. They had intelligence about a high-value target, but when they got there, everything went wrong. Hayes felt his chest tighten. He knew this story, not the details. Those had never been shared beyond a very small circle, but he knew the outline. He knew what everything went wrong meant in that valley in February 2010. He said people died who shouldn't have died, the woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. Civilians. He said his team lead made a call that saved American lives, but cost Afghan ones. He said he'd followed orders because that's what you do, but that following orders didn't make it right. And he said, her voice cracked. He said he couldn't carry it alone anymore. A tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away this time. So I told him I'd carry it with him, she said. That's when he gave me the coin. He said it was the only physical proof that any of them existed, that any of it happened. He said if something happened to him, if he didn't come back from the next mission or the one after that, someone should know. Someone should remember that it wasn't all glory and honor, that sometimes we asked our people to do things that broke them. Hayes sat perfectly still. This was the part of war that never made it into the history books this woman taught, the part that happened in the spaces between official reports and classified briefings. 3 months later, she said, 2 men in dress uniforms showed up at my apartment. They told me Michael had died in a training accident. They were very sorry. They gave me a flag and some papers and left. There was no funeral with full honors, no cemetery plot at Arlington. They said he'd requested cremation and that his ashes had been scattered at sea per his wishes. She looked directly at Hayes. But I don't think he's dead, Colonel. I think my brother is still out there somewhere, living with what happened in that valley, and I think the army let him disappear because it was easier than dealing with what he knew. Hayes felt like he'd been gut-punched, because she was right. He'd seen it happen. Operators who knew too much, who'd been involved in operations that couldn't ever be acknowledged, who became liabilities if they stayed in service. Sometimes they were quietly retired with new identities and enough money to disappear. Sometimes they were given jobs in the intelligence community where their knowledge could be contained. Sometimes they just vanished from the records as if they'd never existed. And sometimes, rarely, they were officially declared dead when they weren't. "You think he's alive," Hayes said. Not a question. "I know he is," she replied. "I've seen him." The airport noise seemed to fade completely. Hayes leaned forward. "What do you mean, you've seen him?" "Twice," she said. "Once in 2015 in Washington, D.C. I was there for a teaching conference. I saw him in a metro station, different hair, beard, civilian clothes, but it was Mike. He saw me too. We made eye contact. And then he turned and walked away, and I didn't follow, because I understood what that meant. And once more, 2 years ago, in Chicago, Different appearance again, same eyes, same way of moving. He was with a woman and a little girl. They looked like a family. She picked up the coin one more time, holding it up so the light caught the gold inlay. So I carry this. I carry it because he asked me to. Because someone should remember. Because the official story is a lie. And someday, maybe not in my lifetime, but someday, the truth should matter. Colonel Hayes sat back in his chair. 31 years of service, 3 wars, more deployments than he could count. And he thought he'd understood the cost of what they asked people to do in the name of national security. But sitting across from this high school teacher in a Cleveland airport cafe, holding her brother's challenge coin and carrying his truth for 15 years, Hayes realized he'd only understood part of it. The cost wasn't just paid by the people who served. It was paid by everyone who loved them. Everyone who had to carry the weight of what couldn't be said, what couldn't be acknowledged, what couldn't be grieved properly, because officially it never happened. "I'm sorry," Hayes said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. She shrugged, a gesture that tried to be casual but couldn't quite pull it off. "You didn't give the orders. You didn't put him in that valley. You were just doing your job, same as everyone else. That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't, but it makes it understandable, and understanding is about the best we can hope for." They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the airport continued its eternal cycle, arrivals and departures, hellos and goodbyes. Thousands of people passing through on their way to somewhere else, carrying their own stories, their own burdens, their own coins, both literal and metaphorical. Colonel Hayes looked at this woman, this teacher who carried classified truth in a canvas bag, who'd been forced to become the keeper of a ghost story that might not actually be a ghost. And he made a decision. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "There are people who need to hear this, people who might be able to tell us more, give us answers." She shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't tell you this so you could—" "I know," Hayes interrupted gently, "but you've been carrying this alone for 15 years. That's long enough. Let me help. Even if all I can do is confirm that you're not crazy, that what you saw was real, that your brother deserved better than the ending they gave him." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something he couldn't see. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Chapter 3. The Revelation. Colonel Hayes pulled out his phone, but before he could dial, the woman reached across the table and put her hand on his wrist. "Wait," she said. "Before you make that call, before you bring other people into this, you need to know everything. Not just what I've told you, the whole story, because once you make that call, there's no taking it back." Hayes set his phone down on the table. "I'm listening." She took a long breath, like a diver preparing to go under. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It carried a weight that hadn't been there before, the weight of someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation in her head for years, waiting for the right person to finally hear it. "That meeting in Pittsburgh," she began, "the one where Mike gave me the coin. He told me more than I said. He made me promise, made me swear on our parents' graves that I wouldn't repeat it unless I was absolutely certain the person I was telling could handle the truth and wouldn't use it to hurt the people who were just following orders." Hayes nodded slowly. "I've spent 3 decades keeping secrets that could end careers and start wars. Whatever your brother told you, it stays between us, unless you decide otherwise." She studied his face one more time, then seemed to find what she was looking for. "Operation Copper Valley," she said. "That's not what Mike called it. He said the official designation was something else, Operation Clear Harvest. But the men who were there called it Copper Valley because of the way the sun hit the mountains at dawn. Made everything look like it was on fire, like the whole valley was burning." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard that name whispered in classified briefings, Clear Harvest. One of those operations that got mentioned once, briefly, then buried under so many layers of classification that even asking about it would get you removed from the room. Mike's team went in with intelligence from the CIA, she continued. They had drone footage, intercepted communications, human intel from local sources. Everything pointed to a compound in this valley being used by a high-value target. Someone important enough that they were willing to risk a direct action raid in territory we didn't officially control. She wrapped her hands tighter around her coffee cup, even though it had long since gone cold. The insertion went perfectly. They fast-roped from helicopters at 0300 local time, no resistance. The compound looked exactly like the intelligence photos. They breached, cleared the first building, secured 3 military-age males. Everything by the book. Hayes had been on enough of these operations, from the command side, to know that when someone says everything by the book, it means something went catastrophically wrong immediately after. Then they hit the second building, she said, and that's when it all fell apart. A family walked past their table, parents and 2 young kids, the youngest in a stroller. They were arguing about whether they'd checked enough bags. The mundane normalcy of it felt obscene against what the woman was describing. The second building wasn't full of fighters, she said quietly. It was full of civilians, families, women. Children, elderly, maybe 20 people total. They were terrified, screaming. Some tried to run. And Mike's team, they realized immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't a terrorist safe house. This was just a village compound, someone's home. Hayes closed his eyes briefly. He'd heard variations of this story before. Bad intelligence, misidentified targets. The fog of war condensed into a single moment where you had to make a decision with incomplete information and live with the consequences forever. Mike said his team lead, a captain whose name he never told me, made the call to extract immediately, to get out before things got worse. But then they took fire from outside the compound. Real fighters showed up. Maybe they'd been tipped off. Maybe they were just in the area. Doesn't matter. The team was pinned down inside a compound full of civilians with hostile forces outside. She paused, and Hayes could see her fighting to keep her composure. The firefight lasted 47 minutes, she said. Mike was very specific about that. 47 minutes of hell. The civilians were caught in the crossfire. Some tried to run and got cut down by the fighters outside. Some were hit by rounds that came through the walls. Couldn't tell if they were American or enemy. Mike said he watched a little girl, maybe 6 years old, bleeding out on the floor while he and his teammates were returning fire over her body. She was crying for her mother, and he couldn't stop shooting long enough to help her, because if he stopped, more people would die. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she kept talking, like she'd been holding this dam back for so long that now that it had broken, she couldn't stop it. They called for air support, for extraction, for anything, but the compound was too close to structures housing civilians. The rules of engagement wouldn't allow close air support, so they fought their way out on their own. The team lead made another call to use white phosphorus grenades to create smoke cover for their extraction. It worked. They got out. All of them made it to the landing zone, but the white phosphorus set fire to part of the compound. Hayes felt sick. White phosphorus in an enclosed space with civilians. 14 people died, she said. Mike's team didn't know the final count until after. The official investigation found 7 fighters, 4 civilian men, 2 women, and 1 child. The child was the little girl Mike watched die on that floor, 6 years old. Name was Amina. Mike learned her name afterward because he made it his mission to learn all their names. He said if he was going to carry what happened, he should at least know who he'd failed to protect. She wiped her eyes with a napkin from the coffee shop dispenser. The investigation cleared the team, she continued. Officially, they'd acted appropriately given the circumstances. Bad intelligence wasn't their fault. Taking fire from actual hostiles justified their response. The use of white phosphorus was within protocols for smoke cover. Nobody got court-martialed. Nobody even got reprimanded. The captain who led the team got a Bronze Star for bringing all his men home alive. Hayes knew exactly how this worked. He'd seen it countless times. An operation goes sideways, civilians die, but the men on the ground followed all the rules, so there's nobody to blame except the nebulous concept of war itself. But Mike couldn't live with that, she said. He knew they'd done everything right according to their training and their orders. He also knew that a 6-year-old girl was dead because he'd pulled a trigger over her dying body. Both things were true, and he couldn't reconcile them. She picked up the challenge coin again, holding it between them like evidence in a trial. This coin, she said, was given to him by his team lead the day after they got back. The captain gathered the whole team, 8 men who'd survived Copper Valley, and gave each of them one of these. He said they'd done the impossible. They'd survived a trap, fought their way out, and lived to tell the tale. He said they were the kind of warriors America needed, the kind who could make the hard calls and keep functioning. Her voice had gone bitter. Mike told me he took the coin because refusing it would have raised questions, but he said it felt like blood money, like he was being rewarded for something that should have gotten them all condemned. So when he gave it to me in Pittsburgh, he said he was passing the burden. Someone outside the military, outside the classification system, outside the chain of command. Someone needed to know that these coins existed and what they really represented. Hayes looked at the coin sitting on the table between them. In the cafe's lighting, it didn't look inspiring anymore. It looked like what it was, a piece of metal marking a moment that should never have happened. 3 months after Pittsburgh, she said, Mike disappeared. The men in uniform came to tell me he was dead. But Mike had told me in Pittsburgh that if I ever got that visit, I should assume he'd either actually died or chosen to disappear because he couldn't carry it anymore. He said he wasn't sure which would happen first. And then you saw him, Hayes said, in D.C. and Chicago. She nodded. Both times, he looked different. Different hair, different style. But the way he moved, you don't forget how your brother moves. And his eyes. You can change everything else, but you can't change your eyes. Hayes was quiet for a moment, processing everything. Then he asked the question that had been building since she started talking. Why are you telling me this? Why now? You've carried it for 15 years. You could have gotten on that plane and never spilled your bag, and we never would have had this conversation. She smiled, but it was one of the saddest smiles Hayes had ever seen. Because I'm tired, Colonel. I'm so tired of carrying this alone. And when you stopped me, when you recognized the coin, I thought maybe this is why. Maybe I was supposed to miss that flight. Maybe you were supposed to see what fell out of my bag. Maybe after 15 years of Mike being dead but not dead, someone else from that world needs to know the truth. She leaned forward. And maybe, she added quietly, if enough people know, eventually someone will have to acknowledge it. Someone will have to admit that we asked our people to do impossible things and then abandoned them when those impossible things broke them. Hayes picked up his phone again. This time, she didn't stop him. I'm going to call someone, he said. Someone I trust. Someone who might be able to help us figure out if your brother really is out there. And if he is, maybe we can do something about it. Like what? She asked. I don't know yet, Hayes admitted. But step 1 is finding out the truth. Everything else comes after that. He started to dial, then paused and looked up at her. I need your name, he said. Your actual name. She hesitated, then nodded. Sarah Mitchell. It was Sarah Chen, but I took my ex-husband's name and then kept it after the divorce because it felt safer. In order to connect me to Michael Chen if someone came looking. Sarah, Hayes repeated. I'm going to make this right. I don't know how yet, but I promise you, what you've carried for 15 years won't be for nothing. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. Hayes dialed a number he hadn't called in over a year. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Hayes, this is unexpected. Hey, Frank, Hayes said. I need to call in that favor, the big one, and I need you to not ask me why until you hear the whole story. There was a pause on the other end. Then, where are you? Dallas, Fort Worth, Terminal C. Give me 2 hours, Frank said. And Hayes, this better be worth burning that favor. It is, Hayes said. He looked at Sarah as he spoke. "Trust me, Frank, it is." He ended the call and set his phone on the table. "Who's Frank?" Sarah asked. "Frank Mendoza, retired Master Sergeant. He spent 23 years with the activity before he finally aged out. If anyone can dig into what really happened to your brother, if anyone has the connections and the clearances to find out if he's alive and where he is, it's Frank." Sarah looked down at the challenge coin in her hand. "What if finding the truth makes things worse?" she asked quietly. "What if Mike disappeared because that's what he needed to do to survive? What if dragging him back into the light destroys whatever peace he's managed to find?" It was a good question. Maybe the best question. Hayes thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Then we'll know," he finally said. "And knowing, really knowing, not just suspecting, that's worth something. Even if we can't do anything with the information, even if the answer is that we have to let him stay disappeared, at least you'll know you weren't crazy, that what you've been carrying was real." Sarah nodded slowly. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from finally setting down a weight you've carried so long you forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. 2 hours, she said. "What do we do until then?" Hayes gestured to the terminal around them. "We wait," he said, "and we remember why this matters." He pulled out his wallet and extracted his own challenge coin. This one from his time with the 4th Infantry, before JSOC, before he'd gotten deep into the classified world. He set it on the table next to Michael Chen's coin. 2 pieces of metal, 2 stories, 2 ways of serving that led to 2 very different endings. "My coin," Hayes said, "represents the unit I was proud to serve with. The missions I could talk about. The men and women I watched get promoted, retire with honor, go home to their families." He tapped Michael Chen's coin. "This one," he said, "represents everyone who couldn't do any of that. Everyone who gave everything and got nothing back, except the burden of knowing what they'd done and why it could never be acknowledged." Sarah picked up both coins, one in each hand, weighing them. "They look the same," she said. "Different designs, but the same basic thing, metal and meaning." "Yeah," Hayes agreed. "But the meaning is what kills you. That's what your brother understood. That's what broke him. Not the firefight, not the civilians who died. The meaning, the burden of carrying something true that everyone else called classified." She set the coins back on the table, side by side. "Do you think Frank can find him?" she asked. "I think Frank can find anyone," Hayes said. "The question is what we do when he does." They sat together in the coffee shop, 2 strangers connected by a dropped bag and a piece of metal, waiting for answers that might change everything or nothing at all. And somewhere in America, in a suburb of Chicago or a small town in Montana or a city neither of them had ever visited, maybe Michael Chen was living a quiet life with a new name and a family who didn't know he'd once been someone else. Or maybe he was dead for real, and everything Sarah had seen had been grief and wishful thinking given shape by resemblance and distance. Either way, they were going to find out. The truth was coming, and Colonel Robert Hayes had learned a long time ago that the truth, once it started moving, was unstoppable. Frank Mendoza arrived exactly 2 hours later, moving with the efficient purpose of a man who'd spent decades operating in shadows. He was compact, solid, maybe 5'9", with graying hair cut military short. His eyes swept the coffee shop before settling on Hayes and Sarah. "Colonel," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm and brief. "Frank, thanks for coming." Hayes gestured to Sarah. "This is Sarah Mitchell." Frank's gaze moved to the challenge coin on the table. His expression didn't change, but Hayes saw the recognition in his eyes. "Ms. Mitchell," Frank said, taking the empty chair, "that's an interesting piece of hardware you're carrying." "It was my brother's," Sarah said quietly. "Your brother." Frank looked at Hayes. "You said this was important. I'm starting to understand why." Hayes leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "Michael Chen, Captain, Army Special Operations, Operation Clear Harvest, February 2010. Officially died 3 months later in a training accident. Unofficially, his sister has reason to believe he's still alive." Frank went very still. Clear Harvest. That's not a name I've heard in a long time. You know about it? Sarah asked. Mom, I know about a lot of things I can't talk about. But yeah, I know about Clear Harvest, not the details. But I know it happened, and I know why it got buried. Tell us, Hayes said. Frank glanced around the coffee shop before continuing. Clear Harvest was supposed to be a textbook raid. Instead, it turned into a situation that left civilians dead and created an incident we couldn't acknowledge. The unit did everything right according to their training. The problem was bad intelligence. The operators involved were given a choice: continue serving with the understanding they'd never speak about it, or accept a medical discharge with full benefits and a non-disclosure agreement. And the ones who couldn't live with either option? Sarah asked. Frank's expression softened. Those are the ones who disappeared. The Army has a program, completely unofficial, completely deniable, for operators who know too much. They get new identities, new lives, enough money to start over. In exchange, they cease to exist as their former selves. Sarah's hand moved to the challenge coin. So Mike is alive. If your brother was part of Clear Harvest and he's not in Arlington, Frank said carefully, then there's a strong possibility he went into the program. But Sarah, you need to understand. That program exists because those men and women can't come back. Not ever. If your brother's out there with a new identity, trying to find him puts both of you at risk. I don't care about the risk, Sarah said, steel in her voice. I've been carrying his story for 15 years. I didn't ask for that. He gave it to me because someone needed to know. Now I need to know the rest. I need to know he's okay. Frank studied her, then looked at Hayes. You know what you're asking me to do. You're asking me to violate security protocols and potentially compromise an active cover identity. That's not just career-ending. That's potential federal prosecution. I know, Hayes said. That's why I'm calling in the favor, the big one. Frank's jaw tightened. Hayes had saved his life in Baghdad, pulled him from an overturned Humvee under fire, stayed until medevac arrived. Frank had promised anything, any time. Hayes had never collected, until now. God damn it, Hayes, Frank muttered, but there was no real anger in it. You're sure about this? I'm sure. This woman has been carrying a burden she shouldn't have had to carry alone. She deserves to know if he's alive. She deserves closure. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I'll make some calls. But understand, if I find him, if he's in the program, we can't just have a reunion. Breaking that could unravel everything. I understand, Sarah said. I don't need to talk to him. I just need to know he's okay. That's all. Frank pulled out his phone and walked to the far corner of the coffee shop. Hayes and Sarah waited in silence. Minutes stretched. Sarah ordered another coffee. Neither would drink. Hayes checked his phone, messages from his wife, emails from command, all the normal life that suddenly felt very distant. Frank was on the phone for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, his expression was unreadable. I talked to 3 different people, he said. Called in favors I was saving for emergencies. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this table ever. Are we clear? They both nodded. Frank took a breath. Michael Chen is alive. He's living in Spokane, Washington under the name David Morrison. He's been there for 12 years. He's married. He has 2 daughters, ages 9 and 7. He works as a high school guidance counselor. By all accounts, he's living a quiet, stable life. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She covered her mouth, her body shaking. He's okay? He's really okay? According to the monitors, yeah, Frank said. He's been in therapy since entering the program. The last report indicated he was doing well, stable, engaged with his family. No signs of the trauma that made him leave. Hayes felt relief wash over him. For Sarah, for Michael Chen, who'd found a way to survive. Can I see him? Sarah asked. Not talk to him. Just see him? Frank shook his head. That's where I draw the line. Any contact creates risk. If he recognizes you, it could trigger a crisis. And if anyone monitoring the program notices you in Spokane, it puts both of you under scrutiny." "So that's it?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I know he's alive, and I still can't do anything." "You can know," Frank said gently. "You can stop wondering. You can stop looking for him. You can know your brother found a way through, that he's helping kids who need guidance from someone who understands trauma. That's not nothing." Sarah wiped her eyes. "What do I do with this?" She held up the challenge coin. "He gave it to me to remember. But if he's moved on, does it still mean what it meant?" Frank reached out and gently closed Sarah's fingers around the coin. "That coin represents a truth that still matters. Your brother isn't the only operator who carried the weight of operations like Clear Harvest. There are hundreds, maybe thousands. That coin is a reminder that we ask our people to do impossible things, and sometimes those things break them. You keep carrying that coin, you keep remembering, because somebody needs to." He pulled out his own challenge coin and set it beside hers. "I carry this because I'm proud of what we did, but also because I remember the cost. Your brother's coin represents the same thing, service and sacrifice, just with a different ending." Hayes added his coin to the table. 3 coins, 3 stories, 3 paths through the same impossible reality. "We remember," Hayes said quietly. "That's what these coins mean. And we remember that sometimes the truest act of service is letting someone go so they can survive." Sarah held her brother's coin close. "I'll keep carrying it. I'll keep remembering. And someday, when the classifications expire, I'll tell his real story, not as Sarah Mitchell, whose brother died in a training accident, but as Sarah Chen, whose brother survived and found the courage to start over." Frank nodded. "That's exactly right. The truth matters, eventually." He stood. "I need to go. You two should forget this conversation happened. Just know your brother is okay." "Wait," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "Give me your number. I won't use it unless it's important, but I need to know I can reach you." Frank hesitated, then gave her the number. "Your brother was a good man in an impossible situation. Take care of yourself, Sarah." He shook Hayes's hand. "We're even now, Colonel." "More than paid," Hayes said. "Thank you, Frank." Frank disappeared into the terminal crowd. "I should book another flight," Sarah said. "Get back to Cleveland." Hayes smiled slightly. "Tell them you had a family emergency." "It's not a lie," Sarah laughed, a short surprise sound. She gathered her things, carefully zipping the coin into her bag. "What happens now for you?" she asked. Hayes thought about his flight home, his wife waiting, the meetings and briefings ahead. "I go back to work, but I'll remember this. When I'm in meetings discussing operations and acceptable risks, talking about collateral damage like numbers on a spreadsheet, I'll remember that every number represents someone's brother or sister. I'll remember the decisions we make have costs that get paid by real people." Sarah stood, extending her hand. Hayes took it, not a casual greeting, but a firm grip between 2 people who'd shared something significant. "If you ever need anything," Hayes said, "call me. You carried your brother's burden for 15 years. You're not alone anymore." "Thank you," Sarah said, "for stopping me when my bag spilled, for recognizing that coin, for caring enough to make that call. You gave me closure." Hayes watched her walk away toward the ticket counter, just another traveler, carrying a story nobody else would know. Except now Hayes knew, and Frank knew, and somewhere in Spokane, a guidance counselor named David Morrison was living his life, maybe never knowing his sister had finally found the truth. Hayes headed toward his gate. He'd be home by midnight. Tomorrow he'd return to Fort Belvoir, back to briefings and decisions and military leadership. But he'd be different now. Because he'd learned something in Terminal C that he should have learned long ago. The cost of service wasn't measured in ribbons and medals. It was measured in the weight people carried long after the operations ended. And sometimes the truest courage wasn't fighting the enemy. It was living with what you'd done and finding a way forward anyway. Michael Chen had found his way. Sarah Mitchell had found hers. And Colonel Hayes walked toward his gate, carrying a new understanding of what service really meant, not just to those who served, but to everyone who loved them. 3 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of her classroom in Cleveland, watching her students file in for another day of American history. It was early spring, winter finally loosening its grip, promise of warmth filtering through the old school's windows. Her students settled into their seats with the usual teenage chaos, backpacks hitting floors, phones being silenced, conversations trailing off. Sarah waited, her hand resting on her canvas bag. The same bag that had spilled its contents across an airport terminal 3 months ago. Inside, carefully wrapped in soft cloth, was her brother's challenge coin. She carried it everywhere now, not hidden in shame, but present. A reminder of the truth she'd finally been allowed to know. "Notebooks out," she said. "Today we're talking about something different than what's in your textbook. We're talking about the cost of service. The real cost. Not battles and dates from chapter 12. The human cost that gets paid by those who serve and the families who love them." The classroom quieted. Her students could sense when she was about to tell them something real. "How many of you have family members who served in the military?" Half the hands went up. Keep them up if they ever talked about what they experienced in combat. Most hands went down. Only 3 remained. "The people who've seen war don't usually talk about it," Sarah said. "Not because they're keeping secrets, though sometimes they are, but because some experiences don't translate into words. Some things you carry that you can't share, even with people you love." She reached into her bag and pulled out the cloth-wrapped coin. Her students leaned forward. "This belonged to my brother. He was Army Special Operations. He served in Afghanistan. And he carried things, experiences, memories, decisions that eventually became too heavy for him to bear while wearing a uniform." She held up the coin so they could see it, though the details remained unclear from their seats. Some things could be shown without being fully revealed. "My brother is gone now," she said. The words weren't quite a lie. Michael Chen was gone. David Morrison existed in his place, but before he left, he gave me this and asked me to remember, to bear witness that service isn't just about heroism and honor, though those things are real. It's also about sacrifice, about impossible choices, about living with consequences long after the mission ends. Jessica, whose father had done 3 tours in Iraq, raised her hand. "What kind of choices?" Sarah rewrapped the coin. "The kind where every option is terrible and you have to pick one anyway. The kind where following orders means living with something that breaks you from the inside. The kind that don't make it into official reports or medal citations." She walked between the rows of desks. "When we study history, we learn about dates and strategies and political decisions. But behind every event are real people making real choices with real consequences. People who come home changed. People who can't come home. People who carry the weight of what they had to do for the rest of their lives." She returned to her desk and set down the wrapped coin. "So when you see veterans in your community, remember something. The price of freedom isn't just paid on battlefields. It's paid in living rooms and therapist offices and quiet moments when memories surface. It's paid by families who watch them struggle. It's paid in ways we don't talk about because they're uncomfortable and don't fit neat narratives about heroism." Complete silence. Even the troublemakers were paying attention. "Your assignment: talk to a veteran in your life. Not about combat. Don't ask unless they volunteer it. Ask about coming home. Ask about the transition from military to civilian life. Ask what they wish people understood about service. Then write about what you learned, not about battles, but about being human in impossible circumstances." After class, Jessica lingered. "Miss Mitchell, my dad doesn't talk about Iraq, but sometimes I hear him at night struggling with something. I never knew it was okay to ask about coming home instead of what happened over there." Sarah smiled gently. "It's more than okay. It might be exactly what he needs. Someone asking about his experience of being back, of being your dad again after being a soldier. Sometimes the hardest battles happen after people come home." Jessica nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you for making it okay to acknowledge that service is complicated." After Jessica left, Sarah sat alone. She unwrapped the coin and studied it in the afternoon light. Somewhere in Spokane, her brother was probably finishing his own day of helping students. Different name, different life, but still serving. She kept her promise. Hadn't tried to contact him. Hadn't traveled to catch a glimpse of David Morrison. She'd let him have his peace, his fresh start, his chance to be someone who wasn't broken by what Michael Chen had experienced. But she'd also kept his other request. She was remembering, bearing witness, teaching a new generation that the truth about service was more complex than any textbook could capture. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Heard you're doing good work. Keep teaching them the truth. F. Frank Mendoza checking in. Sarah typed back, "Thank you for giving me the closure to do this work." The response came quickly. "Your brother would be proud." That evening, 1,500 miles away, Colonel Robert Hayes sat in a conference room at Fort Belvoir. They were discussing a proposed operation, classified details, strategic objectives, risk calculations, clean PowerPoint slides with clinical language, collateral damage estimates, success metrics. Colonel Hayes, the briefing officer, looked at him. Questions about the ROE. Rules of engagement, clean lines on paper that would become messy reality for the operators who had to execute them. "I have a question," Hayes said slowly. "What's our plan for the personnel who carry out this operation? Not just the immediate debrief, but long-term support. What happens to them 6 months from now, a year from now, if things go sideways and they're living with decisions we're asking them to make today?" The room went quiet. "Sir, we have standard protocols for psychological support," someone began. "I'm not talking about standard protocols," Hayes interrupted. "I'm talking about what we do when those aren't enough, when operators carry the weight of following our orders long after the operation is forgotten by everyone except them." He looked around the room. "Before we greenlight this, I want to know we've thought as carefully about the cost to our people as we have about strategic objectives. Because the real cost isn't measured in dollars or equipment, it's measured in what we ask our people to carry for the rest of their lives." The general at the head of the table nodded slowly. "Colonel Hayes makes a good point. Let's add a section about long-term personnel support, real support, if this goes wrong." The meeting continued, but something had shifted. Hayes had planted a seed. He'd honored what he'd learned in that airport terminal. He'd spoken up for the Michael Chens of the world. That night, Hayes called Sarah. "I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." "I'm okay," Sarah said. "Better than okay. I'm teaching my students about the real cost of service, using Mike's story, without classified details, to help them understand that history is made by real people who carry real consequences." "Your brother would be proud," Hayes said. "I hope wherever he is, he's found peace." "I think he has. And part of that peace comes from knowing his sister didn't let his truth disappear." 6 months later, Sarah received a package. No return address, postmark from Washington State. Inside was a photograph, taken from a distance, of a man with 2 young girls at a park. They were laughing, playing on swings, absorbed in an ordinary moment of family joy. The man's face was only partially visible, but Sarah knew immediately. The way he moved, the way he pushed his daughter on the swing with gentleness that spoke of someone who understood how precious peaceful moments were. No note, no explanation, just the photograph. Sarah understood. Someone wanted her to see that her brother wasn't just surviving, he was living, really living, building a life that included joy and normalcy and love. She framed the photograph and put it on her desk at home, next to the challenge coin in a small display case. 2 reminders, one of the cost of service, one of the possibility of healing. In her classroom, Sarah continued teaching. She taught about wars and conflicts, but she also taught about the human cost, about veterans who carried invisible wounds, about families who served alongside them, about the importance of remembering that behind every historical event were real people making impossible choices, And every day she carried that challenge coin, not hidden, not displayed openly, just present. A reminder that some truths needed to be carried until the time was right to share them fully. Some of her students would go on to serve. Some would become teachers, policymakers, journalists, or citizens who voted on when their country used military force. And because of what she taught them, they would understand that asking people to serve meant accepting responsibility for what that service cost them. That honoring veterans meant more than platitudes. It meant building systems that supported them. It meant acknowledging that not every story had a tidy ending. It meant carrying the truth even when uncomfortable. In Spokane, David Morrison helped a troubled teenager work through trauma. The kid reminded him of himself, angry, lost, carrying something too heavy. David knew how to reach him because he'd been there. The kid would be okay. With support and time and understanding, people could survive almost anything. At Fort Belvoir, Colonel Hayes reviewed operations with new perspective. He asked harder questions. He pushed for better support systems. He became known as the officer who cared as much about aftermath as objective. He knew what mattered. And in Cleveland, Sarah Mitchell stood before a new class and asked, "How many of you have family members who served?" Hands went up. "Now keep them up if you really understand what that service cost them." Most hands went down. Sarah smiled gently. "That's okay. That's what we're going to talk about today." She reached into her bag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped challenge coin. And she began to teach them about the truths that matter most, the ones we carry not in history books, but in our hearts. The ones passed from person to person, generation to generation, in moments of honesty and courage, and the simple act of remembering. The bag had spilled in an airport terminal. What fell out was more than metal. It was a story that needed telling, a truth that needed honoring, a legacy that needed carrying forward. And now in classrooms and conference rooms across America, that legacy was being honored. Not in grand gestures, but in small acts of teaching and learning and remembering. That's how change happens, person by person, story by story, truth by truth. It all began with a dropped bag, a fallen coin, and a colonel who stopped to ask a question when he could have kept walking. If someone in your life has served, take time to honor them. Not just with words, but with understanding. Not just on holidays, but every day. Ask them how they're really doing. Listen when they're ready to talk. Give them space when they're not. Remember that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. And if you're carrying your own story, if you served, saw things, did things, can't quite let it go, know this: you're not alone. What you carry is real and valid and worthy of support. Asking for help isn't weakness. It's courage. We owe you more than gratitude. We owe you genuine support, lasting care, and acknowledgement that what you did and what it cost you matters deeply. Share this story. Talk about it. Use it to start conversations about the real cost of service. Honor their service. Support their healing. Remember their sacrifice. That's how we truly say thank you.